Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Who's That Pokemon? It's Princess Di and Other Unlikely Anime. Now, my wife has criticised my comic description for not being super clear on what the panel is actually about, but I did want to use that limited word count allocation to let people know this will be outside the usual sweary, silly tone used in my Heroic Failures panels. I have a background in academia, who knew? So the idea of the panel was to go over and examine the kinds of anime that are based on non-Japanese stories or other source material. I found there's some extremely surprising sources out there, and I also wanted to share some of the fun things that have turned up with people in general. Some credit should also go to friends who've helped to contribute ideas to the panel. Thank you, Pudding and Eternal President AJ. Chatting to you two has really made me sure that I wanted to get this written. My intention is largely to stick to Western IP, particularly as there's more innate cultural crossover when it comes to stories from closer to Japan. So if I went based just on numbers, we would end up with 59 minutes on Journey to the West, I think.
That's so pretty.
So just for the purposes of the panel, I've tried to work with a reasonable definition of what is anime. If we go with an animation produced primarily in Japan with an intended Japanese or near simultaneous release for Japanese and international audiences, seems reasonable. So that would be that Avatar isn't anime, even though it's of interest to fans of anime. Ruby isn't anime, but Ruby Ice Queendom is anime. And for a final type of example, you would say that The Last Unicorn wouldn't be anime, as even though it's animated by Topcraft, the screenplay, direction, and intended audience for the first viewing were American. There is some stuff that's probably a bit borderline, but my intention isn't to rules lawyer the definition. It's more to have a central idea for this premise and a good way to compare anime to one another. So Japan, for this premise itself, has always looked overseas when it comes to production of anime and manga. The earliest mass cartoons published in Japan were based on the British Punch satirical magazine style, and the earliest commercial animations were heavily inspired by Disney and by Betty Boop. Even so, Japan tends to look inwards when imagining their audience. Many of the anime which are truly popular outside of Japan are much less successful in Japan, and vice versa, with some of the more obvious examples being Cowboy Bebop and Trigun, which are very, very successful internationally with lower local recognition, whereas Anpanman and Precure are just absolute blockbusters in Japan, and they're never going to be able to set anybody else on fire. Japanese creators, therefore, take a variety of approaches towards their inspirations and their source materials. I'm really interested in the different origins of international origin anime. The panel is broken into categories, which are not meant to be exhaustive, instead giving a broad overview of what kind of thing is out there and how Japan grapples with the international source material to either make a completely Japan-friendly product or to fulfill Western commission demands, or to simply take a fun, obscure Japan concept and run with it as a passion project. Do feel free to interject by the end of each segment with anything fun I've missed, as it is impossible to find or include everything on my own in 1 hour. Finally, for anybody wondering about literature in this panel, myths and legends, world masterpiece theatre, children's books, plays and novels, there are so many that it was more than a panel on its own. I've broken my research into its own category for that. If people are interested, I would be very happy to run a panel on those as well next year. But I thought it would be giving everything short shrift if I tried to cover everything. It wasn't coming together. Have the rest. The first look then is at games, which is something it would be easy to think of as a Japan for Japan category. Nonetheless, there are hundreds upon hundreds of anime based on Japanese gacha, RPGs and classic games, but also an interesting range of anime based on non-Japanese games. So for the first example, we have an anime purely derived from a foreign property for the purposes of entertainment, being aimed at smaller children. I will mostly be skipping Asian source material for time reasons, but we have a really good example of just something that suits a child audience. It's based on the Korean MMORPG. It is a straightforward, gutsy fantasy set on a floating sky island, where after the destruction of the world tree, the humans are blamed by the other tribes for this incident, and the protagonist has to pass himself off as a member of the different tribes of the world, with their differing skills and ways of living. Essentially, from what I can find out, it is a somewhat generic fantasy where he's going around learning a moral lesson by the end of each episode, being very explicit, to be quite a simple story, but it sounds cute. The game relaunched in 2017. It is still live, and it has had a comparatively recent crossover with Isekai Quartet. The next one is a good example of anime that is made from a game purely for the purposes of marketing. We have an anime made from a game which had the most wild marketing backstory. That would be Dante's Inferno. So it's based on an American IP, but the game obviously being itself loosely based on the Italian novel. The game company had an elaborate marketing campaign where they staged fake protests against their own game.
I remember this.
They also promoted a fake game which supposedly let you participate in live church services. But then when you attempt to order the game, you are accused of acts of heresy and sent to a website that lets you buy the actual game. They would also run adverts promoting fake services and then accuse the viewer of committing the sins implied by those adverts, such as adultery and so forth. They rickrolled journalists with boxes that were sent to their offices that played Never Gonna Give You Up when they tried to open them. They had to be destroyed, and when you destroyed the box that stopped playing the music, it would open up and say you've committed the sin of wrath. So it is with that in mind that they also looked into getting an anime made. It doesn't sound like it's super exciting, but you can sort of see where they're looking, what can we do? We want lots of attention. We want to bring in these ideas. They've gone to Japan and said, make an anime, please. And then Japan have gone, sure, we will do that. Because it's not, only debuting outside of Japan, but it's clear that the impulse to make that has come from the Western side, who want that as an advertising tool. It's just another way of bringing more focus to that through art. And then have another example of something similar, where you have the pre-existing thing. And I'm going to be sort of tending more mainstream, getting less mainstream throughout each segment. So you probably mostly have heard the following one as well. But it's a good example of anime being used to flesh out the backstory where it's been thinner. So it is a one-shot giving the backstory of the existing character Cassandra. I found various reviews from the time which basically said, this is a really badass anime and it's not at all interesting. It really looks like it's not an anime, with the way that it looks, the way that it was marketed and everything. But it debuted at the same time in Japan, it has a Japanese director, and it has completely Japanese animation production. By any reasonable definition, there is a Dragon Age anime that doesn't seem to be very interesting. Alongside this anime, we have Paragon Lost, which takes place during the events of Mass Effect 2. You therefore have another example of the anime being used to sort of fill out the blanks in the story, which is more sort of an artistic thing than purely a marketing premise. It's sort of creators who've got all this material on the characters, and they're saying, here's a way to add depth or show you what we were thinking about when we created this. Because Cassandra, as I understand it, in Dragon Age is quite taciturn about her feelings and her backstory. So it's not just a question of, look at this, we've made this up to make you look at it. It's more like, here's another go in this world that it wouldn't have suited to have in the game. So we have sort of a next example as a co-production, being a thing where both properties are wildly popular in the first place. So having an anime made of that property would really just do nothing but good to both things. Two flavors both taste great together. We had the Genshin Impact anime coming soon. And the reason that that's super interesting, this originally came out as a highlight reel of the animation. As a lot of you probably know, Ufotable are known for being quite experimental with their use of CG integration with 2D environments for really interesting effects. For instance, they did the Fate Stay Night Heaven's Field movies. They had a lot of really, really gorgeous stuff where they used full CG to map out how they were having the characters move through very difficult environments. And then they sort of overdrew that to have it look 2D in the style that people visually wanted to see, with very, very clever and accurately mapped fast movements in 2D. So it's a really interesting thought, because Genshin Impact, for anybody who's not looked into it, is it's a true multi-platform MMORPG with it's not PvP, but you can visit each other's worlds. So it has to stay really simple visually in some ways. It has a lot of limitations because it has to run on people's phones and PCs and PS4s and stuff. So Ufotable initially put out just a generic reel of how they would handle making this world that people spend so much time in more vivid and more animated. I've got just a little clip of the highlight reel, which is going to obviously now be a full anime. That wasn't necessarily the case when they put this out. And it's just quite exciting for fans of Genshin, because they've been experiencing like strong emotions about this environment that is quite low quality compared to the way that this feels as an anime. Opposed to a faux table draw. Had to cut it somewhere. It was really hard with the music, but yeah, it's quite exciting seeing how they're going to handle that because it's a silent protagonist game where you play as one of the two main characters. Nobody knows what they're going to do about that because either the boy twin is the protagonist and the girl twin is the villain, or vice versa. Do we have any info?
Yeah, despite them being silent protagonists within the game itself, there is multiple voice clips of them in there.
Oh no, sure, no. I mean, they're used as silent protagonists, definitely. People tend to get quite frustrated that they're spoken for a lot in the game because they're both good voice actors in every language that they have dubbed. Yeah. Just to mention as well that one of the interesting things about seeing it adapted as an anime is that it's sort of a recursive cultural element because MiHoYo, now HoYoverse, market themselves as a Chinese otaku team. They are very, very aware of the things that have inspired them. And they put tiny references to things that they love from Japan throughout the game, not just in the Japanese-inspired setting. Like Legend of the Galactic Heroes and Kino no Tabi get shout-outs of all things. It's really, really interesting seeing what they're going to do, and it feels very modern in that regard. So we have, for the next example, an anime which helps to enrich and make more vivid the setting of the game. Originally, for anybody who doesn't know, this game released fucking broken. And it was just unplayable. It was a joke at the time. But it's fixed. Everybody says it's fixed, and that's great.
It is a good game.
Most successful beta test.
Yeah, absolutely.
Until Starfield.
But you know, given the time it takes to make a good anime, it's as they were starting to turn it around that they put out such a successful anime based on it.
It's a really good role-playing game too.
And it's the first thing on this list that has a really notable pedigree as an anime. The director is Hiroyuki Imaishi from Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann, Pantheon Stocking with Garth Belt, Kill la Kill and Promare. And the composer is Akane Yamaoka, who did the Silent Hill franchise. This is just a victory lap for this to have an anime at this point. It may have done more to promote anime than to promote the game, because the anime was so successful that it found new viewers without particularly compromising itself as an artistic work.
Despite never releasing it as a DVD.
Yeah, well, that's how it is for streaming first things. That's how the licensing is tied up. It's infuriating, but it's where we're at in 2024. So we have a good example for the next one as an anime adaptation, which is an art for art's sake situation. This follows the multi-studio anthology format of the earlier Animatrix. B-Train, Bones, Casio Entertainment, Production IG, Studio 4C, Toei Animation each produced segments for this project. It was held by the mech designer and innovative mad lad, according to my notes, Shinji Aramaki. Halo is perceived as a laddish franchise with a lot of shooty guns, but it does have a very interesting setting and lore. The anime has been seen as a way to highlight those elements without just attacking and alienating the more bro-ish side of their fan base. It's kind of a way to
I
just
can't read anyway.
go into what they've been working on or trying to work on there. Now, we have next a game which had a relatively basic theme and setting, as I understand it. So the anime was used as a way to make a really interesting story that's set within the world that's proposed by the setting. Yeah, so as you may know, Niantic were the creators of the original Ingress game, and it is the engine which they ended up building Pokemon Go just directly on top of. And the idea originally was that you would go around to notable artistic spots and that you were trying to collect data, real-world art points of interest. Those are Ingress locations. You can see exactly how that's translated into Pokestops and Pokemon gyms. So the anime is used to develop on the setting of the original game, using original characters and story that were not found in that, as I understand it. And the mechanics of the game were reflected throughout the anime, where the protagonist uses psychometry, which is where you read the memories of objects that you touch. Quite a fun superpower, not that often depicted, it's kind of hard to handle. The next one I would call anime as shovelware. It was funded and produced by ABB Films, showing that the trend is older than it may appear. Contemporary reviews pointed out that Sin the anime was enormously derivative of older anime, such as Bubblegum Crisis in particular, and went so far as to accuse it of showing flashes of competence. Carl Masek, he also the concept of Masocing, where you take various anime and recut them into a single anime, such as in particular Macross. He is the guy who wrote the screenplay for Sin the movie. The game itself was fairly generic. It was developed in the Quake 2 engine. It sold poorly at the time due to competition from Half-Life, which came out roughly the same time. And the last in this example, which I'm hoping may be a surprise to some people, trying to do some deep cuts, is an anime that was made just because the source material was super popular in Japan, and that's just how it is. And they make an anime of something that is selling really well over there. It'd be wizardry, which I'd hoped to surprise you with, but I know I didn't get you. It was an extremely difficult dungeon crawler. It was the first true party-based RPG. The original programmer was Robert Woodhead, and the Mad Overlord's name is Trebor after him. Robert Woodhead went on to found Animego, the very important early anime Western company. The franchise is very popular in Japan. Along with Ultima, it is seen as the inspiration behind most JRPGs initially, particularly Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. The anime itself is noted for being very faithful to the video game. Now, this is going to have to keep being a bit of a whistle-stop tour. For that reason, I've elected not to include full rundowns on films and TV, which were adapted to anime, as I'd originally planned. I felt that they fell on very similar lines. They're usually commissioned either due to Western interest in continuing or expanding a franchise. So that would include Blade Runner Black Lotus, Star Wars Legends, Highlander The Search for Vengeance, Supernatural, and of course the Animatrix. But the one more interesting anime that's got a relationship with some kind of film will be coming up later. The second section, therefore, is on comics, a very natural source for animation adaptation. It's not particularly common for non-Japanese comics to be adapted into anime, though. There is so much manga already to hand that there needs to be a compelling financial, artistic, or educational reason to bring a comic into the hands of the Japanese production staff. I did do my research and identified quite a few anime adapted from Korean manhwa and webtoons. I've also elected not to go over those closely, but what I found very interesting was that every manhwa I was able to find out more about were very recent. The oldest I could find were no less Tower of God and God of High School, all of which came out in 2020. There are also the slightly lesser known Gosu and A Return as Magic Should Be Special, and the currently running Solo Leveling and Dot Release. I was surprised to find out that Why Renliana Ended Up at the Duke's Mansion is Korean in origin, but is actually a web novel, which is the only such example that I found. The broad conclusion I draw from this is that Korean fiction is being treated as a source due to globalization more than for any other reason. That extreme recency bias makes it look like Solo Leveling, for instance, just had so much hype, even in Japan, that it crossed the deck of the producers like any other manga would have done, which is obviously not a bad thing, but I would say that it's not of specific interest in terms of the panel. Some adaptations were co-productions, but the consideration generally seems to be mass appeal, rather than anything niche or specific passion projects from the Japanese side. That is not always the case with comics from outside of Asia, so I've chosen to go into that a bit more. beginning with the more commercial projects, swiftly moving through them, and then going into the weird territory. So initially we have just a quick look at the Marvel comics. I know regarding X-Men, we have this one, which I know X-Men fans didn't always receive super well. They were like, "Oh, why did you make up some Japanese kid just to make it all about her?" Hisako Ichiki was a major character in the comics at the time and predated the anime. She's a good character, and people who whined about it and said it was woke nonsense were super wrong. She's a great character. It's so silly. Wolverine anime, obviously not a silly idea either. The character spent a considerable amount of time living and working in Japan even before the anime scene was mainstreamed in the US. There are two more that were part of a set. They crossed over, they had internal continuity, and it was a simple project called Marveru Anime. The stories all took place in Japan, and they were guided by talented writer and sex pest Warren Ellis. There are a couple of others. Future Avengers is the kind of property that's seeded by a large company to attract local interest while the viewers in that area are young. There are equivalent productions in the West, such as Avengers Next. It's probably a bit of a deep cut, but it's a similar marketing strategy. Future Avengers went on to get a second series and a manga, and the characters did eventually make a minor debut in mainstream Marvel comics. One more that I've turned up, Disc Wars. It is a daft series where, for contrived reasons, children are able to manifest trapped Marvel heroes for 5.5 minutes per episode. Seems very convenient. DC also has a few anime. Batman Ninja. Batman gets isekai'd with Catwoman. Growly hijinks ensue. Fair assessment?
Yeah.
That's what I was able to find out.
I felt high watching it.
The other Batman one being Gotham Knight, which is another anthology film. Studio 4 Degrees, Madhouse, B-Train, and Production IG worked on this. There was a book of the anime of the comic. It was by Wheezy, Louise Simonson, talented old school Marvel writer, so it's probably really very good. I would love to read that now I've heard about it. There is one more DC anime coming soon. Does anybody know what that one is? Oh, good, surprise! I have not made up this title. It sounds really good the more I look into it.
That could work.
The Suicide Squad have 62 hours to escape from the isekai or they will be exploded. The screenplay is by the same team as Vivi Floret's Eyes song, so that sounds like it's gonna slap. So moving to slightly less mainstream but still sort of borderline cape comic stuff. Borderline cape comics. We have Witchblade.
I was about to say that.
I wouldn't forget your big titty actually. So this is a reimagining by a Japanese studio for a Japanese audience of the 90s comic from Top Cow. The protagonist in both versions is still a lady with a big old shiny bum. But in the anime, she is a single mother who has lots of feelings. And that sounds honestly really fun. I've heard it's very good. Yeah.
It's not Witchblade.
Oh no, I'm not at all being nasty when I say she's a lady with a big old shiny bum. I'm like, that has its place. I like that she also has lots of feelings in a child. So, again, a little bit less mainstream. I didn't know for sure that this was a comic originally until I looked fully into it. This is an adaptation of a creator-owned comic by an animator who worked in Korea on the Avatar shows, LaShawn Thomas. I get the impression that he's an ideas guy who will create comics and not necessarily see them out to their fullest extent, but he can use these publications to shop ideas around. They had a crowdfunded pilot, which was also by Satellite. Backers never received the rewards. LaShawn Thomas also created Children of Ether, and he worked on Yasuke, the samurai anime on Netflix. Once again, a slightly deeper cut if you're not aware of it. Have Little Nemo, Adventures of Sunderland. This spent the entire 80s in development hell. Every person in the scene, in American filmmaking and in Japanese filmmaking, seriously looked into working on this or did do some work on this throughout the 80s. That included George Lucas, Chris Columbus, Hayao Miyazaki, and Osamu Dezaki, all of whom either actively worked on it or expressed an interest in trying to work on it. It ended up being led by Yutaka Fujioka, who was then the head of TMS. what he wanted was a full animation film instead of the slightly limiting techniques and the lower frame rate that's used even in higher budget anime from Japan. And he wanted to compete with Disney by just making this very full, very rich thing. And it was a flop. And he'd staked his entire career on it, and he retired. He didn't, just wasn't able to work in that way anymore. He was like, hey, I tried it, that did not work, I get it, I stepped down. And that is the actual reason that TMS, who had spent so much money and time on this, spent all of the 90s doing outsourced animation for American productions, which is why they animated Batman, the animated series that some of you may well remember. The production work that they did on Batman, the animated series, was something that they found really inspirational and enjoyable. They used those skills, that knowledge of those kinds of environments and lighting techniques that they enjoyed for that, to then make their in-house creator-owned IP, The Big O, at the end of the 90s, which is directly from people who'd be working on Batman. They're like, hey, let's do Batman with robots and tragedies and high camera. Let's have a look at the original comic for Little Nemo. It is a 1905 long-running series about, I haven't actually written it down or anything, but from what I understand, it's about a little lad, and every night he goes to sleep and he has these big adventures. And it's just the most gorgeous looking comic. It has these breakdowns between the panels that I've just never seen anything like from anything that old. It's just the most high fantasy, odd looking thing. I would love to read some more of that. And I would love to go and see the film soon. Next one is, I had assumed wrongly that this was not an anime because of marketing, making it look like a thing that was being pushed as anime and was not like in the most transparent, oh, buy our anime kind of way. No, this is an anime. I was just being a fool. It is based on a comic by a Scottish writer and a Filipino artist. I'd assumed it had no connection with Japan since it was covered in Mark Millar's name, and Mark Millar is a big I own this, please make my things guy. And any deep cut Marvel fans may well remember that Mark Millar does lick goats, as we know. You remember. There's an accusation made in Next Wave when they didn't want to be in a crossover. Super Crickets is actually a spin-off of Jupiter's Legacy, which has a live-action adaptation also on Netflix. It came out exactly as Jupiter's Legacy was cancelled, also by Netflix, because the left hand does not know what the right hand is doing. It was adapted into an anime by Daisato, Sato, the only man who can make versions of Eureka 7 that are good. Every project on Eureka 7 since the main series was not made by Daisato, and at this point I'm pretty sure is actually spite trying to sabotage his legacy and career. I cannot understand what's going on if it's not that, and I think there must be some kind of drama going on. Next one, I feel like people only know about the comic or about the anime, because I've really surprised a friend of mine who works in animation with this one. Valerian and Laureline. This is a co-production with France, but again, it aired in Japan, it's got a Japanese cast, it's a pretty anime co-production, but it is based on the 1965 Valerian et Laureline, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, which I am almost certainly not. It was a 21-volume sci-fi comic. It's actually the originator of the name Laureline, or Laureline, I'm not certain, I should have looked it up. It was invented to sound period appropriate, the name. Several thousand French women are now called Laureline, the first of whom was born only a year after the comic first came out. I get the impression that it really, really did it for people. It's about sort of a time cop guy going around adventuring through time, and he's told not to interfere with things. And on his very first mission, he meets a woman in, I think, the 11th century who's going to be executed. He goes, oh no, I'm not having that, and steals her. And they go and do time cop things together. So they're from wildly different centuries, but they have these missions together. It just sounds very, very fun. Same IP. Cara Delevingne and large, non-moving eyebrows. But I can get a step more obscure than Valerian et Laureline.
Why did Laureline get cut out of that other one? It was just
because people don't like women.
We actually see what that title is.
Purely sexism.
Say again?
It also could just simply be that in the West, and you're doing a big budget movie,
having a short, snappy title.
Sure, give it one that doesn't only have the boy name. I don't mind what they
Let's
call
call it
it.
something
Just
else.
call it City of a Thousand Planets. So that's they called it Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets. It's pretty mouthy.
Does it have the character?
Yeah. That's the guy and the girl. It's about both of them, but they named it after him, even
get
though
the same
she's
screen
right from
time.
the start in the comics. Yeah, so that's the whole thing. Well, I think she might have been added a tiny way into the comics, but very much like it is the comic about those two doing things, whether or not it debuted on it.
Stories also.
That makes sense.
It was only a very early one.
Yeah, it's like finding their feet, isn't
Yeah,
it? That
and
he's
also
going along, picks her up.
Like the original was a very different art style. It looked more like the Smurfs than anything. Then it became somewhat more realistic.
Yeah. Because it was coming out over a long period, so that
Yes.
makes a lot of sense.
Some of the other stuff are actually worth checking out though.
Yeah, no, it sounded really, really interesting. When I was talking to my European animator friend, they were just like, "What? Why is there an anime of this? That kind of looks garbage, but okay, you should read these comics if you can get them in English, you monolingual fool." You know who I'm thinking about. So, Wowzer is another one adapted directly from a European comic. It was known as Domeru Togon in Japan. It's based on the Belgian comic Cubitus. It is about an anthro talking dog whose owner invents things. The human girl next door has a crush on him and he eats bone. Yes. He's just a dude who's a dog, from what I can see. But it does seem like that's quite a strong thing to go with when he's a bone-eating dog. I thought that was some choices that were made there. It was actually the first TV anime that was produced by JC Staff. Yeah. A really interesting studio. I know this stuff is amazing or it's garbage, but it's like there's never really much in between. They are a really interesting studio. I don't know what they're up to ever, but kind of chaotic. It's fun. The comic Cubitus was first launched in Tintin magazine, and looking up images from this whole thing got me put on a list. I will not be elaborating. We have oxtails. An anthro ox called Bose, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, runs a farm where every animal in the world exists. It is based on a gag-a-day comic from Holland. The animals were given names when the anime adaptation was made. For instance, the gorilla was now named Shampoo. Perhaps finding this undignified, in the dub they renamed him to Gaylord.
Of course.
Much higher stakes.
It is filled with very, very highbrow Dutch humour, the original.
What he said.
We have what's being called the first manfra now. It is made by a French artist who grew up on Dragon Ball, the original comic. Here we are. But there's an anime that's just a direct adaptation. It's a guy who loves anime. He grew up on Dragon Ball. He made this very, very anime-inspired setting, and the anime people were like, "Yeah, that looks good. We'll make that as an anime." I mean, that makes sense, right? But he is primarily. God, no, don't undermine me, rabbits. I understand what he was upset about. Yeah, it just seems like one of those natural things to adapt into an anime rather than looking outside of your cultural setting to adapt something. He's so influenced by certain Japanese storytelling techniques in the first place that while I don't think he was soliciting an anime adaptation, the manga has been published the French comic has been published in Japanese pretty much from the start, as I understand it. It's been called the first manfra. Where have my notes gone? Yeah, some of the promotion of the comic in Japan was done by Yusuke Murata and Hiro Mashima, respectively, the Ice Shield and One Punch Man guy, and the Fairy Tail guy. So some of the art, it's really hard to even tell whether the original French artist did it or whether one of those two did it, because seriously, the styles are really, really close and they're able to mimic each other's work very well. You can see it's something that all parties just really wanted to succeed. I don't believe it's a wildly unusual story per se, it's just a thing that works well. It is in the age-old tradition where a nice young man fights a thing. Getting again a step more of school, we have an anime based on a property by an Italian physicist. Yay! I haven't seen it, so I'm very sorry if my understanding isn't complete. But researching it really, really made me want to watch it. It looked so interesting. I even watched the pilot. It's so cool. It is about 4 adventurers who travel around space, finding a moral every episode. And the idea is that these are working class astronauts, which was a bit of a take to have at the time, I think, because it's not just this adventure story. It's sort of got a bit of class consciousness. And it's a bit more grimy. It's a bit more of an outlaw star than a Star Trek. As I understand it, they approached this guy and they said, we would like to license this to produce 22 episodes. He did then find out that 77 episodes had in fact been made only after they'd aired in Japan. The artist had some bad experiences in indie publishing. He's only gone back to comics after he retired. He now self-publishes. I found Dojinshi. I'm not really sure how to feel about them. But I do have just the opening credits just to show you how these were sort of handled. I thought they were very charming.
Really opening.
So I've got just one more that got added a little bit later in my research. Somehow we've got more in there. The last comic to anime adaptation I'm looking at here, I will be very, very careful to avoid the spoilers if everybody in the room could also avoid spoilers if they know spoilers. Essentially, this is based on a Canadian-created comic series, which came out under Oni Press. It's basically a scenester time capsule. It was very much inspired by the artist, his life, his interests, his nerdy hobbies, and so forth. And it wasn't for everybody. It was a bit Marmite, but I think it was really, really lovely. And when you look back on it now, it is now already very retro because it's so set in its time and place. Scott Pilgrim himself isn't meant to be heroic, which is one of the things that people tend to misunderstand about it. He is completely half-assed when it comes to actually being a scumbag. So he's not unpleasant to read about as a character. Science Saru, the Japanese studio, people from there read Scott Pilgrim, and they came to Brian Lee O'Malley and they said they'd like to adapt it. He said he had no interest in doing that. There were already adaptations of his work, film. He didn't want to do it. A couple of years later, Science Saru came back to him and said, we've reworked our idea. We would like to handle this in a different way. And we'd like to develop on some of the themes and make a more modern production based on all of the concepts and the settings and the characters from Scott Pilgrim. And he said that was really cool and he would love them to do that. So they've made an anime and it sounds like it would be a really, really good take. So,
I find it interesting what you're saying about the comic being very dated. But with both the film and the anime, they adapted things.
yeah,
So
exactly.
that
That's
they
the
are-
idea, is that I
Yeah.
think Brian Lee O'Malley is saying the comic is the comic is the comic. And
Yeah.
all that he's happy to update is adding colour and things to just add to the production values. This is later colour work of the original ink art, as I understand it. But he won't let them just directly adapt it because he's got that control. Because it's creator owned IP through Oni Press, I believe. He's just saying only if you're doing something cool, and he has enough money and time to say just if I like it, which I think is very artistically valid and fun. I have no idea what my notes are referring to, but it says this brings me to a fun little sidebar. Just as Trigun's popularity in the West led to the making of Trigun Stampede, and probably also to the reboot anime, sometimes a property is popular enough in Japan to get a sequel that is in Japan. More specifically, I've got a few examples of anime made in Japan as a sequel or a reboot of a Western property. starting naturally with it's Pingu. I hope that I'm not so old that anybody in this room massively needs Pingu to be explained to them. Pingu is originally Swiss. The penguin characters spoke a fake penguin language, meaning it never had to be translated. Pretty good. Because it didn't have to be translated, it was shopped around the world. It ended up being more popular in the UK and in Japan than in other places, leading to both countries making continuations. The penguin language was based on Grammarlog, which is an ad hoc language used in clouding, which I thought was really cool. Getting a tiny bit deeper, although I realise that somebody at this con has probably covered this. This followed the 2002 film, which also had 3 sequels and a TV show in the US. Oh, whoops, no. In Stitch, the character ends up in the Ryukyus as the pet of Kanehara Yumi, who does karate rather than hula, but is being used in a sort of a Lilo fill-in role. It had 3 series and 2 OVAs. The next version, following the anime, reboots to a non-Japanese continuity. The newer one has it in China, with an orphaned girl in a rural community whose sister wants her to move to the city with her. Essentially, Stitch, throughout these franchises, is collecting troubled young girls like Wolverine, or to make that reference more anime relevant, like Shah Aznavour. The next one, I've just written down a description of what happens in the series because it's quite intensely adapted.
Yeah.
Professor Utonium, his son Ken Kitazawa, and his toy dog Peach are busy working on Chemical X, a powerful chemical substance in Tokyo City, New Townsville in the English dub, when Peach accidentally drops a Daifuku into a vat of Chemical X, which magically transforms it into Chemical Z. Countries around the world suddenly experience weather calamity, and Ken uses a light beam ray attached to the vat of Chemical Z to glance Chemical Z on an iceberg in the Tokyo City Bay, causing black and white rays of light to appear in the skies above it. 3 ordinary girls, Momoko Akatsutsumi, in this light too, Miyaku Gotokuji, and Kaoru Matsubara are engulfed in white light, which transforms them into Hyper Blossom, Rolling Bubbles, and Powered Buttercup, the Powerpuff Girls Z. Peach, the dog, is also engulfed in said white light, transforming into a toy dog who can talk and call the girls together to transform. Numerous rays of black light engulf people, animals, and objects to transform them into evil monsters who want to take over Tokyo City, such as Mojo Jojo, Fuzzy Lumpkins, Princess Hineko, Seducer, the Gangrene Gang, and the Amoeba Boys. The Powerpuff Girls must protect Tokyo City from evil monsters with the help from the Professor, Ken, Mayor, and his assistant, Ms. Bellum, and with their respective weapons, Blossom's yo-yo, Bubbles' red rod, and Buttercup's hammer. This was a 50th anniversary project for Toei. I am going to pull up the opening animation because I wanted to flip this on my wife, who has always been horrified at the idea of taking something she perceives to be a culturally perfect property. It can be argued that both the Powerpuff Girls and the Mashita Powerpuff Girls Zeta serve the purpose of putting cute girls with differing interests and personalities into the local superhero rubric. In America, therefore, they are coded as caped heroes, but in Japan they are very clearly magical girls. But this does have the side effect of making the Mashita Powerpuff Girls Zeta seem less original, because magical girls have been popular since Sally the Witch, and there's nothing necessarily innovative about anything except for their origin in American media. Last in this small section is the Little Humpback Horse. This is the last Tezuka film, TV series. He died when it was in production. It is based on a Russian feature film, or possibly the remake of the Russian feature film, which is in turn based on, I've written it down, the book, which is by Peter Pavlovich Yershov. So yeah, it was remade by its own creators in the 70s. Tezuka was always really inspired by a lot of European fairy tales. Essentially, it's the story of a little humpback horse who goes on adventures. I wasn't able to find out how super similar they were, but you can see it's a much more sort of punchy Tezuka sort of kid on an adventure kind of thing. A magical horse is rescued by a human boy and promises to come to his aid if he ever needs him. But when the boy's father disappears, he calls on Blue Blink and they set off on a journey together. It's actually based on traditional storytelling from Russia, but the version that's known is
If
this.
that disappeared in Russia, you ain't getting him back with a magical horse.
It's okay, I believe it's set in Japan. maybe he's very magic. Maybe he can stop people from falling out of windows. And drinking tea. Yeah, it looks really cool. I would really like to see it. Apparently it's on YouTube. I think I'm hanging in there all the time. I didn't have time to time this out because I decided I was going to do everything this weekend because I'm an idiot. These biographical elements. No. Alright, there we go. That's right, there's just a couple more in between. This brings me inelegantly to classical music. A favourite thing of Tezuka's, though, this is a true thing, hence Phoenix is the Firebird inspired by the Firebird Suite by Stravinsky. Okay, that's a link between the two things. I did find two anime based, however, loosely on classical music. Maeterlinck's Bluebird, thank you, AJ. This is based on The Bluebird, a 1908 play by Maurice Maeterlinck, a Belgian. It premiered in New York as an opera in 1919, hence the music connection. In this story, a poor brother and sister seek happiness, accompanied by the boy's beloved Bluebird. The anime features characters and designs by Leiji Matsumoto. I don't know how much you can tell from this distance and at this res, but you can sort of see a lot of Maple in there because Leiji Matsumoto could draw one woman and he was very, very happy with that woman. Plenty of people were, so I'm not judging him. This one is a little bit more involved. We have an entire, I think called Masterpiece Theatre, check it in a minute, series based on one song.
It's not part of one Masterpiece Theatre, it's part of something else.
It is based technically on the 1854 American song written by Stephen Foster about his wife, who he was actually in the process of separating from. Because this song is biographical, this anime is supposedly based on the real childhood of Foster. It's not. Jeannie, who loves music, and her friends Stephen and Bill are growing up in a small town in Pennsylvania in 1938. Stephen plays the harmonica, Bill plays the banjo. After Jeannie's mother passes away, she starts going through various trials and decides eventually to devote her life to treating the sick. And that there is Jeannie with the light brown hair, with that very Japanese interpretation of what light brown hair means. I will not inflict the song on you directly, but the first verse's words are, I dream of Jeannie with the light brown hair, born like a vapour on the summer air. I see her tripping where the bright streams play, happy as the daisies that dance on her way. Many were the wild notes her merry voice would pour, many were the blithe birds that warbled the Oh, I dream of Jeannie with the light brown hair, floating like a vapour on the soft summer air. A Japanese writer who I found referred to this series online as being the last of the era of adapting Western literature to anime. They claimed it was the last one, other than the World Masterpiece Theatre series. This is nonsense. Gankutsu, Romeo and Juliet, Great Detective Poirot, Marple, When Marnie Was Ronja the Robber's Daughter, to name but a few, spring to mind, for anime made later than this that are direct adaptations of Western literature. But the emotional truth of the statement by the Japanese writer is definitely valid. This is the last anime of the era where directly adapting a traditional Western story for a general audience was a common or a valued genre for what it was, especially as a thing for children. That writer that I found claimed that this was the final seeing the West from afar anime, which I definitely agree with. They linked it to the subsequent influx of Brazilian immigration into Japan. This took place at precisely the point when this had come out, and you then immediately see that stories are less removed when they're adapting Western works from that point. These biographical elements, does that make sense, bring us neatly to the final section on real people and incidents. A lot of anime out there are based loosely on historical figures, whether real or mythical. The absolute chaos of the Fate franchise in particular is to be blamed for the time I mispronounced the name Goblin in front of a family member, potentially losing my Irish citizenship rights. There are a lot of anime which will also use historical figures as a very minor character or as an idea, thinking of the final episode of The Vision of Escaflowne here, for instance. But there are a select few, and I will be semi-brief, I know, with somewhat time on time. They cover the stories of non-Japanese people as more than just an idea. Starting with, it's surprisingly hard to find much on this. That is probably partly because some people find it distasteful, but it's also because it doesn't seem to be a very good film. Justin Savakis at the Anime News Network said it contained truly odious filmmaking and weird directorial choices that just don't work, and that he couldn't think of a worse way to experience the story than watching this film.
I mean, living it in person and being your dad would be a pretty bad way to
Yeah.
experience it.
Now my next one, I have no notes. It simply says, if I can't info dump about Berubara, I have died. The Rose of Versailles is a 1979 anime and manga on which I wrote, well, it's 1972 manga on which I wrote my dissertation.
This is very 90s style just looking at it.
It initially was supposed to follow the life of Marie Antoinette as a tragic central figure, the manga. It later became known for the invented character of Oscar Francois de Jager, who is an assigned female military commander who has her gender as an open secret. She sort of has a masculine role for social reasons, and only people close to her tend to know that she's female. I use she, her for convenience. She sort of flip-flops on that herself, as you would imagine it throughout the story. But she's sort of this later character who became more popular. Essentially, it is based on real stuff with lots of actual real incidents, like the affair of the diamond necklace and all the events leading up to and around the French Revolution throughout the story, even as the focus shifted towards the more popular fictional Oscar. The reason that they can focus more on Oscar is not just that she was popular as a dashing, feminine, masculine figure, but because Marie Antoinette's story is set in stone, and they're able to use a figure like Oscar to run around France and do things and find things out and tie all the elements of the story together. It's cracking. Watch it, read it. It's officially translated, finally. Oh my god. Going again a tiny bit deeper, we have the Chevalier d'Eon. This is, interestingly, based on a Japanese story, technically, written by Tao Lupata, who's also known for Marduk Scramble and the latest Psychopath materials. His version of the story is a historical thriller based on the real-life Charlotte d'Eon de Beaumont as the central figure. She was a real-life androgynous spy who fought in the 7 Years' War. The real d'Eon was assigned male at birth, but he claimed to be assigned female at birth and raised male. She secured legal recognition as a woman, my notes are brief, from Louis XVI in 1777. In 2012, a 1972 painting by Thomas Stewart was identified as a genuine portrait of d'Eon, and it is now in the National Portrait Gallery in London. The anime features d'Eon switching between the role of her assigned male self and her sister, who may or may not have been murdered, as I understand it, and going around France and being swashbuckling and dramatic and cool and trying to solve mysteries. I think maybe is being possessed by the dead sister. That sounds so good. I definitely want to see that. Yeah, it's such a cool idea. Such an interesting figure. Really, really good idea for a story. I can't hear you because of the fan. That's
I really hope that Chevalier what was his name? Chevalier St. George is in it as well.
I have no idea.
Black one.
I don't remember him being in there,
No,
but they did
that
have a
would be
duel in
cool.
real life.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, they duelled each other.
Yeah.
Oh, I've got to look more into this. That sounds so good.
But yeah, both those people, historical people, are fascinating.
The next one I've got is deeper cut again. We've got Alexander Senki, which was also released as Reign the Conqueror in the US, so you may have heard of it under that name. This is a Korean co-production which reimagines the life of Alexander the Great using a team of animators from around the world, as you've often heard on co-productions. The version of Alexander Senki that they were using to depict the real Alexander is based on a novel by the polymath academic Hiroshi Aramata. Next one is the story of the Traps family singers.
Oh, wow.
You may well know that this is based on a book depicting real incidents, the story of the Trapp family singers, and the film is based on the book. This is not based on the film, this is also based on the book. So, unlike the film, it uses the right names for the children. Unfortunately, they are not the right names for the right children, but an attempt was made. This is a World Masterpiece Theatre series, you may well be aware of it, adapting many Western properties into family-friendly products, which are of generally very high quality for TV anime, and very, very safe, but often going into slightly deeper themes than equivalent Western productions would be happy to do, depicting death and tragedy and so forth. Really, really interesting stories. On a very, very culturally different note, we have as an adaptation of some of these real-life events into real stuff, or less real stuff, we have Minamicon! Oh, I've tried to write down a pronunciation. Dougal again is commonly known by the courtesy name pronounced in Japan as Kome, so I will not fight the pronunciation any longer. Living 1,800 years ago at the end of the Eastern Han Dynasty and in the early Three Kingdoms period, he was a real-life strategist who was regarded as the greatest of his age. The anime and manga it's based on posit an isekai of him into modern Japan when he's died of old age and so forth. In Japan, he befriends a struggling young singer who's somebody on the conf is cosplaying today, looking very good. Kome applies everything that he knows from the battlefield and from the theory of strategy to making the singer's conquest of Japan through the medium of music a successful conquest in her battle of the charts. It's really good. It's such a silly idea. They run with it really, really hard. The pacing goes up and down. It's still such a fun idea, and they really commit to it. The very last one that we've got is, of course, the title of the panel. Beyond the Rainbow, the story of Princess Diana. Now I did. Thank you for taking down an option.
She's been gone.
So I did go to the effort of tracking down and watching this one properly, just for the purposes of researching the panel. We were exactly on the time. I have called it in my notes completely insipid. I think there's nothing more to say about it. It's just insipid. It was a rush job OVA, TV anime, one episode, which was made because Japan was going nuts before Diana was due to visit the country. There are two highlights in the entire thing. Prince Charles cameos at Diana's 7th birthday party, making their age gap hilariously apparent. And then there is a scene which shows the girls at her school drawing on the walls. Princess Diana very visibly writes her own name in good English. In the next scene, straight away, she's called to see the head teacher who said your grandma's died, and then it ends. I have a clip of that. I spent 4 hours getting subs to work on this horrible YouTube rip, so please appreciate this horrible insipid anime and terrible quality.
お手紙までくださったのよ。あなたは素晴らしい子だ。ご両親が別れてからはうつむいて歩く癖があるが、それさえ直せばもっと素晴らしい子になるって。ごめんなさいね。泣いたりして。悲しい時は泣いてもいいのよ。でもいつまでもくよくよしていてはダメね。はい。強く明るく生きなきゃ、それこそ亡くなられたおばあ様に負けないように。はい。
And a wall
私はもう泣きません。立派に一人で歩いてみせます。見ていてくださ
That's a pretty well mastered theatre.
But What Must Be Sinner is good. That was her hamster on her shoulder there, as people have astutely noted. Its name is Peanuts, and it wins a pet contest at her school. Diana did not have brown hair. She did not have a hamster. It was not called Peanuts because she did not have a hamster. She did not attend a school that had pet contests. There is nothing going on with this anime.
Did she even have a grandma?
We have taken
That's A plus trolling. Okay, I've just got my conclusion then, which is I know that this isn't an essay and doesn't really require a conclusion per se, but I will finish on a specific note. When we make a habit of watching anime and reading manga, it is really easy to get used to putting ourselves into the position of the Japanese viewer, who we know that most anime are aimed at. A story about yokai or about Date Masamune makes sense as a starting point. Scenes featuring the Shinkansen are commonplace, and there's no better place to end a fight than the Tokyo Tower. So it's possible for us to imagine that anime is for us in this way, not as an act of cultural appropriation per se, but from a position of empathy, from familiarity. What is interesting about that sensation is this: being a foreigner to a medium and then coming to watch a story made by familiar creators may then make a theme of your own foreignness to them. So the era of respectful distance between Japanese creators and the international audience may be over, but in this confident and globe-trotting period for Japanese animation, I believe we're definitely going to continue to see adaptations of stories originating from beyond the island nation. And I'm looking forward to seeing more and more stories written with less standoffish craft regarding the theme of gaikokujin, as people take care to call them now, and more intimate tales, bringing in the warmth and knowledge gained by this new era of two-way communication.
Yeah.
There, I can behave for nearly an entire panel.